an extraordinary figure who really left his mark on history there. What kind of a leader has Cuba and the world lost today?
Well, I've got to tell you from a personal level, I was born in Tampa, in Florida. And my whole life, it seems, I have been living in the shadow, the specter, if you will, of Fidel Castro from the missile crisis. I'm also from Tampa, which is now the home of CENTCOM, which then was the home and still is the home of MacDill Air Force Base. I lived constantly in the shadow and the threat, if you will, of Cuba. My friends growing up, many of them were Cuban refugees. I was raised, this is from a personal level now, of hearing nothing but Castro and Cuba and communism, and then Russia, and the two were intermixed. Then there was the, perhaps part of it myth, Operation Mongoose, the CIA, from the Bay of Pigs to the CIA planning to allegedly assassinate Castro through exploding cigars and thallium poisoning where his beard would fall out. I mean, I have spent my entire life basically following a parallel course in Florida, and so many of my friends hearing about and always being reminded of Cuba. It changed the politics because in that particular case, the Miami, Florida Republicans were so connected, so entwined in that of an anti-Cuban rhetoric. That was also a part of the Reagan administration. So to make a long story short, what Fidel Castro meant to American politics, anti-communist, Cold War, Republican, cannot be overestimated in the least. He was mythical. Have you ever seen this man speak for hours? You don't even have to speak Spanish. I cannot imagine anybody being or rivaling his speaking style. They used to say, how true it is, he would take a paper clip or a wire, he would put it allegedly in his cigar, and the ash would basically he would never lose the ash when he smoked. He was mesmerizing. So this man cannot be in any way overstated in terms of the impact, positive, negative, however the media will state, but his presence is just non-paral.
Lionel, the announcement of Fidel Castro's death was long expected. I mean, given his age and his health problems and the fact he hasn't really been seen in public for a long time, what kind of impact do you think this death, will it still send shockwaves across Latin America?
Oh, listen, it has always been thought that he was he was indeed the last of these revolutionary, romanticized, idealized Marxists. And whether he was there, and again, what I'm saying sounds almost propagandistic. I'm telling you what I have heard my entire life. He was the lifeblood of this. Many people thought that Raul Castro was certainly in better shape, but it was Fidel who called the shots. That it was Fidel who, though he might not have been in public view, it was his spirit and his power that was really going to rule the roost. You know, there are many, many people who also remember in Florida. I can only imagine. I've been looking at some of the Miami newspapers. There are newer generations who don't understand what Fidel Castro is. I've got to tell you something. In the past 5-10 years, I have seen Cuba, in terms of the mainstream media, go from this communist bastion 90 miles away from Florida to the land of wonderful music and mojitos and cigars. And I mean, how the media have changed, and many people have suggested romanticized this figure who in many respects was the embodiment of the Cold War. You know, let me tell you something. Russian Nikita Khrushchev and others growing up looked kind of like we did. He wore a suit. He spoke a different language. But there was Castro in fatigues. Also, the connection of his throwing out the mafia and how his involvement in the Kennedy administration being the source of, many people suspect, the assassination attempt through Johnny Roselli and others, and Sandro Trafficante and Carlos Marcello and Meyer Lansky, the interconnections between the mob and how they wanted to join forces with the American government to try to overthrow him through the failed Bay of Pigs, to try to recapture their casino wonderland. I mean, this, you have no idea, I'm sure you do, but many people don't, especially younger, how this man was a part of espionage, the Cold War, the mob, romanticization. I'm really shocked because I've never known a part of my life where Fidel Castro was not a part. And again, being a native Floridian, the second generation, with friends of mine who are Cuban, I can't believe he's gone.
Absolutely. This leads me on to my next question quite nicely, actually, Lionel. I mean, people thought that Fidel Castro was immortal almost, but, you know, he survived multiple U.S. assassination attempts, but he was still left standing. But in the end, he proved to be human, didn't he? Now, what can we expect from his legacy? I mean, we have his supporters who praise him as the man who gave Cuba back to the people, but then we have his opponents who accused him of brutally suppressing opposition. What do you think? How will Fidel Castro be remembered?
I would venture to say by younger members of the mainstream media, especially those who look at the Cold War and look at that period of time when it was not so much, you know, he was a Cold War unto his own. Understand what people, 90 miles away from Florida, there is Cuba with the specter of nuclear weapons. We had duck and cover. And I, again, living in this strategic air command, this, where I'm from, Tampa, on the west coast of Florida, this was ground zero, so to speak. If anything was going to happen, if there was going to be any retaliation against Cuba, it would have taken place from Tampa, and we would have been the target of something. I don't think younger folks understand this, and I'm kind of glad, because especially with a new president, and as the world normalizes, and as I think this Cold War insanity, especially this recently, this blame Russia for everything, this incredible hyper reaction from a lot of forces. I hope this doesn't encourage the wrong nostalgia for those days. Those were terrible days when we were, I mean, on the brink of a real threat, a real specter of actual nuclear war. However, I don't know if young people, especially manning newsrooms, whatever's left of them in conventional mainstream media, really understand what he is. They look at him as a avuncular, this fatigued, romantic Marxist who was viewed as a man who lowered the infant mortality rate and brought medical attention. But other people will call him a brutal dictator, a racist who imprisoned AIDS victims. I mean, depends upon the rhetoric. It depends upon the particular people that you are talking to. I've known political prisoners, and I've known people who were released. I was there in the 80s when they had that first, when people left Cuba en masse, and then later on the systematic freedom that people sought, and it was, forgive me for being so shocked, but so many thoughts are going through my mind. Just watch The Godfather, watch Godfather 2, the specter, the involvement of Fidel Castro. He is so much a part of our history. I just hope, you know, Tolstoy said history would be a wonderful thing if only it were true. I hope today's news folks, especially the younger ones, get this one right.
Castro remains very cautious about renewing ties with the US. He was seen as the symbol of opposing the great power that is the United States. What now?
Well, it's going to. I don't know. It's you know, Cuba is still the land that, in many respects, is frozen. I knew many people throughout years. I'm a lawyer, and friends of mine who are lawyers who actually worked with Cuban officials would send. This is 30 years ago. I saw film when videotape was kind of coming around, to see old cars and to see this kind of the land that time forgot. The question is, who owns Cuba? Who will be the beneficiary of the incredible tourist and business and the like? What's going to happen? We always wondered, nobody really understood who really runs the show there. How will Castro, Raul especially, now deal with a Trump administration? Because this is going to be interesting, because there were people who, while they wanted to normalize relations, and the argument was the U.S. normalization, international relationships with Russia and China and Vietnam. Why Cuba? Why not thaw those very frozen relations out finally? Because remember, at that time, the Cuban American population, who is of the various aspects and demographics of American foreign populations, are very highly educated, very highly upwardly mobile, very, very influential. Ronald Reagan, especially in the 80s, and Cuba, South Cuba, this was the Republican stronghold. So they're now looking, you're going to see the old versus the young saying, what's going to happen now? And what influence will President Trump have in normalizing, if you will, Cuba?
Okay. Now, Andre, in recent years, since Castro's brother took the reins of power, Cuba's relations with the U.S. have been thawing. What impact do you think Fidel's death will have on those relations? Lionel, can you hear me?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Oh, I thought you were talking to someone else. Pardon me. That remains to be seen. You know, up to now, people were saying, what exactly, many people here were saying, what's so strategic about about Cuba? Big deal. I mean, people were saying, it's just a little island. Okay, there's sugar, a cigar industry. Many say that's been supplanted by the Dominican Republic and others. What is this geostrategic influence today? It was only critical because basically at one particular point it housed, allegedly, nuclear weapons. So it's going to be interesting to see. A lot of people are going to say, who owns this? And what influence will the United States have? Remember, 90 miles away, it's been this satellite, if you will. So it's going to be very interesting. Pay close attention to how President-elect Trump, when he has said that he wanted to normalize relations and negotiate with President Putin, with China, you're also going to see that same type of language apply as well. You're also going to be seeing the resurrection of, again, these rather nascent, hardcore, Cold War, Russophobic, almost anachronistic blast from the past, who are going to be talking again about this anti-Cuban rhetoric, you know, and the younger generations are going to say, who are these people? What does Cuba represent today? It's almost the old versus the new. But if you are an historian and a fan, or not a fan, but a historian of the Kennedy assassination, this was during my lifetime. To understand that and to understand how the CIA worked for years against Cuba, just the history, trying to unravel the history is going to be fascinating.
Now, during his life, Fidel Castro spoke of the U.S. needing to pay damages to Cuba for the sanctions that it placed on the country. Is that still a possibility, or is it pie in the sky now he's dead?
Oh, well, of course he's going to be talking about that. And you have a number of individuals, a number of folks who are saying, what about reparations? I can't tell you the number of people, and it's so interesting to see where they are, the number of people that I know personally who say they want their land back. You know, it's very common in American news to talk about reparations, to have individuals reclaim property that was seized. Well, what do you do with an individual, people, during the Batista regime, who was, of course, overthrown by Castro in '59, what are you going to say then? There are a number of people also who still maintain very, very powerful political connections to this country. Remember also that they called the first wave, when people recognized and saw that Castro was making tremendous gains, the first exodus was called the brain drain. This was in the early '60s. Intellectuals and poets and lawyers and doctors who left. They came to Miami, South Florida, other places, and their political clout never waned but increased. What kind of pressure are they going to put on, especially when you have a new administration that is trying to deal, because it's almost a neo-GOP. The Republican Party in particular is so fractionalized. You have Donald Trump, who is, well, he's this unique individual. You're going to hear the old guard come forward. Wait till you hear the old guard, the old cold warriors. You've heard this recently. You've heard people say things, younger, almost reflexively, trying to channel references to the past. What happens when these old cold warriors, so to speak, reiterate that kind of rhetoric, which has been stated against Castro since day one? This week, and especially, we just had the 53rd anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. Keep in mind, I can't say this enough, we're still arguing, still discussing the historical connection between Castro, his involvement, and our involvement through Operation Mongoose and the Bay of Pigs and Alpha 66 and all of these paramilitary groups that were funded covertly and others. You know, the history has to be untangled. And you're also going to hear a lot of people this week say, this was the real legacy. Who was this Fidel Castro? So while we're talking about normalizing relations, there are people who say that he was a tyrant, he was a despot, a murderer. And you also have still people who lionize and who beatify the notion of Che Guevara. You still see this T-shirt. You see people walking around to this day paying homage to this iconic. They don't know the first thing about him. And how many suspect that Castro was involved in killing Che Guevara, as the story goes. So this week, I'm up and have been up. Watch how history, pay attention to Miami, Florida news. That's going to be interesting, because you're going to see a fight between the new generation of Cuban versus the grandfathers, the abuelos and abuelitos, and how you're going to see people talk about reparations. I'll tell you, it's going to be interesting to see what Raul Castro says. And again, what President-elect Trump will do and how he will appease, especially since he has yet to even be inaugurated. What will the old GOP, the old Republican, the old guard say? Will he act tough? Will he rekindle, reignite, remind the world of the history of Castro? Because it's safe to say there are a lot of young people in particular who have no idea of what this man was, a man who has been a part of my entire life as a Floridian and a citizen.
Sorry, it's been really great to have your take and your words on the life and death and legacy of this extraordinary figure. I have just one final question for you.
Certainly.
Is the Cuba that inspired people and countries and generations of Castro's Cuba, Che Guevara, is it still alive now that he's gone?
I would say the actual spread of revolution, because this was the ground zero. I hate to keep saying ground zero, but really the inspiration point. I don't know whether that has been that's going to be continued. But let me tell you what people are going to be talking about. They're going to be talking about how this little island has lower infant mortality, has a better health care. This is what they're going to say. How tries to normalize human rights. This is going to be met with a pushback from individuals who are going to have. Wait till you see, for example, black Afro Cubans who talk about their legacy. Wait till you hear about those individuals with HIV who are going to say, yeah, let me tell you about how Castro handled that. So you're going to have this incredible fight between the avuncular, romantic, fatigued, barbate, you know, the Marxist with a cigar, and this cruel, despotic leader, because there are no, I mean, the only thing that we have today are the almost quasi-mythical Middle Eastern boogeyman. Castro was in a league of his own, the man who came and told everybody on national television, I am not a communist, I have no connection to Russia whatsoever, came to New York, said this on television, repeatedly said, I have no connection whatsoever to Russia, Soviet Union, nothing, and turned out to be lying. So watch how historians, as we speak, try to cobble together